Hello, everyone, and a good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Olia Abasalo. I'm an Olympian and a member of the education team at the International Testing Agency. From all of us at the ITA, we want to wish you a very happy Olympic Day. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 6th monthly educational webinar of 2022, and today we'll talk about the risk assessment. Before I introduce you to our topic fully and to our panelists, please allow me to do some housekeeping first. So a reminder that we are delivering this webinar in 5 languages, and on your Zoom menu, you will see a button called Interpretation. By clicking on this icon, you can select a channel with your preferred language. I will be presenting, of course, in English, but you can also listen in Arabic, French, Russian, or Spanish. And a note as well that the slides will be in English. Some other housekeeping points today. Please do use the chat function to tell us your name, where you're from, your sport, or your role. And I can see many of you already writing in from Qatar, from Switzerland, from the International Tech Ball Federation in Hungary. So thank you everyone, Zambia, Malaysia, Argentina. Thank you to everyone who is writing in. You can also use a Q&A function to ask us a question on the topic that we are presenting on today. And we will leave some time for questions at the end. And please note that it goes without saying that while we encourage debate, interaction, and questions, we do not tolerate any kind of aggressive behavior. We trust that you will all join us in this spirit of fairness, respect, and integrity. So again, thank you to everyone who keeps writing in the chat. I will not be able to say hi to everyone who wrote in, but it's great to see Italy, Egypt, Philippines, so many of you, AFLD, Paris, bonjour, Vietnam. Thank you again to everyone who has joined us today. One final note, of course, we are recording this webinar so that it becomes available on our website and our YouTube channel after the live session. So today's webinar is part of our educational monthly series that are publicly available and designed to tackle key anti-doping topics and to raise clean sport awareness. So a big thank you to everyone who joins us every month, and a welcome to those of you who are tuning in for the first time. As always, of course, I am happy to give a shout out to our official presenting partner who is with us for the 2nd year, and that is Informed Sport. Their investment allows us to deliver the webinar program free of charge in 5 different languages. Very quickly, Informed Sport is a global certification program for supplements that batch tests products for substances that are prohibited in sport. And of course, as supplement contamination continues to be one of the leading causes of inadvertent doping, we encourage all athletes and their support personnel to check all products before using them at sportwetestYoutrust.com. And the ITA is proud to be recognized by UNESCO as a leading international organization for the delivery of anti-doping programs. And this educational webinar is delivered with the support of the UNESCO International Convention Against Doping in Sport. So let's move on to today's topic. A risk assessment is a systematic process that involves identifying, analyzing, and controlling risks. But how does it inform anti-doping organizations' testing and education activities? And why is a risk assessment such an important tool for clean sport? So these are the questions that we'll address over the next few minutes with the help of our guest experts. I would now like to invite them to turn on their cameras so we can give them a welcome. And firstly, I would like to introduce Ronan Coquet. He defended his PhD thesis in sport sciences and physical education at the University of Lausanne in 2016. His sociological studies deal with the shaping of health norms in connection with physical activity. One of Ronan's research interests was in how some athletes progressively normalize the use of performance-enhancing drugs throughout their careers. So Ronan has been working with the ITA since 2018, and he's currently in charge of the development of the risk assessment with the science and medical team. Bonjour, Ronan.
Hello.
Thank you for being here with us today.
It's a pleasure.
Next, I would like to introduce Richard Mann. Richard joined the ITA as the testing manager in October of 2019. He's responsible for overseeing the implementation of the ITA testing programs on behalf of a number of international federations. Prior to joining the ITA, Richard was with UCAD, the UK anti-doping agency, as a testing officer, where he was responsible for the coordination of UCAD's Athlete Biological Passport program. Richard graduated from the University of Birmingham and holds a Master in Sport and Exercise Science. Hi, Richard. Welcome to the webinar.
Hi, good afternoon. Pleasure to be here.
So we're really looking forward to hearing from both of you. And we have our agenda for today coming up, so you can see the plan for the next few minutes. So Ronan will first explain what a risk assessment is and how it is developed. And he will share with us a sport-specific case scenario where we put the theory into practice. After that, Richard will talk about how risk assessment is applied to a testing program. And finally, I will also spend a few minutes on education and prevention opportunities that a doping risk assessment presents. So as always, we will check on your questions at the end of the session. I recommend that you send them a little earlier so that we have time to look at them before we get to the Q&A. So anything related to the risk assessment, don't hesitate to send our way. Also, you will see a few questions appear on your screens during the session. All of these questions are anonymous, so don't hesitate to participate in the interactive discussion, even if you're not sure of the correct answer. So on this note, we do have our first poll question for you, and it should show up on your screen in just a second. And this is to check the general knowledge of the risk assessment of our audience. So I will read it for the purpose of simultaneous translation. So the question is, and some of you are already answering, so thank you. What do you think is the most important factor to consider in a doping risk assessment? The options are sport or physiological risk, country risk, individual athlete risk, or all of the above. So it's great to have such an interactive audience because I finished reading the question and already we have 64% of you who have participated. So we'll give it one more second and I'm reading all the messages in the meantime. Greetings to the Ukrainian NATO, Kyrgyz Republic, Hungary, Turkey, Morocco, South Africa. Thank you to everyone giving us a shout out and a shout out back at you as well. Great, so let's end this poll and show the results. I think most of you selected the last option, which is all of the above. 72% of you said that. And indeed, there are many important factors to consider in a risk assessment. So again, thank you for participating. And this is a good time for us to switch to Ronan and his presentation. So I'll give the floor to you, Ronan, to give an explanation of what a risk assessment is. The floor is yours, Ronan.
Thank you, Olia, and it's a real pleasure to take part in this webinar. So let's start with a few definitions. Doping first. So doping is basically the use of performance-enhancing substance and methods prohibited by the World Anti-Doping Agency. Beyond this simple definition, we assume also that most of the time, athletes are not the only accountable person for these practices. Now the risk refers to the likelihood of something happening. And finally, the assessment is the ability to qualify and quantify something by using relevant indicators and metrics. So risk assessment is a challenging task for several reasons. First, the real doping prevalence in sport remains unknown, and it's difficult to rely on strict evidence to tackle this issue. Doping practices are also influenced by many factors, and various scientific disciplines can address this question of doping in sport: physiology, pharmacology, psychology, sociology, history. So a major challenge is to articulate these inputs and identify in which extent and how they will influence doping practices. So to summarize, the doping risk assessment aims to better understand doping practices in order to provide guidance to the testing and to the educational teams in order also to make proper use of anti-doping resources. Now, as you can see on the screen, this is also something mandatory for the IF according to the ISTI. And each anti-doping organization must develop their own risk assessment. Now we can move to the next slide, please, Olia. Thank you. So just to start, I would like to give you an overview on the methodology that we have in place for this risk assessment at the ITA. So instead of integrating all these parameters at once and at the same level, the idea was to split our risk assessment in 3 steps. So we will have in the first section the physiological risk analysis. So the idea behind will be to really to try to identify how and when to test the athletes. So we will have a look, we will try to better understand the physiological demands of the sport, because we know that this will have an influence on the type of substance used by or methods used by the athletes. We will also consider things related to the organization of the sport, so the organization of the sport season. We will also consider potentially demographic variables in this section. We will also try to identify some doping trends at a country level. So we will rely on the corruption perception index. We will also consider the history of doping in the country. And this will be interesting to identify doping trends for each country and specific sport. And finally, at another step, another part of the risk assessment also is to assess the individual risk based on some individual parameters, so the performance, the testing history. And on the top of that, there is also other team at the ITA who are doing their own assessment based on other type of data. So I'm thinking there at the testing team, the ABP team, and the INI teams. So finally, well, the risk assessment is really the combination of these 9 parameters coming from several data sources. So now we can move to the other slide and discuss more about the I will explain more the physiological section of the risk assessment. Thank you, Olia. So the first thing regarding that is that we have already a lot of information available in the scientific literature regarding the physiological requirement of the sport. But we really identified the need to rely on more scientific evidence regarding this question, because especially when we have to compare sport by sport, their physiological requirements. So at the ITA, we work with a group of experts in physiology and in pharmacology in order to have a comprehensive analysis of the physiological demands of all Olympic sport and discipline. So we established a common measurement framework, and the expert assessed each sport. And the idea behind was really to highlight the doping trends for each sport discipline. Now I can illustrate this part of our work with a concrete example. So here you can see this framework with 6 physiological metrics that have been used to assess and to identify the sport profiles. So here you have the example of weightlifting, and this this analysis has been extended in order to identify which are the most at-risk substances for these disciplines. So it's a key component of the risk assessment because it's specific to each sport discipline, and we will use this information to define the general structure of the test distribution plan. So define the testing volume, the testing frequency, the proportion of in and out of competition testing, and also the analysis. Now, here you can see the process that we follow when we develop the risk assessment. So here you will find the country risk. So again, Transparency International for the Corruption Perception Index. We will rely on the previous ADRV's reports. So an interesting point regarding this country risk is that even if we weight the history of doping in the country with the number of samples collected by an ADO, this indicator doesn't reflect the reality of doping in sport, knowing that potentially we will miss some countries who potentially may use more advanced anti-doping strategies. But it gives us a doping trend for each country and specific sport. So we do this update once per year, and we are able to define this country risk. Now, I will talk a little bit more about the individual parameters that we consider in this general risk assessment. Well, this is the performance. So we rely most of the time on Grace Note database, but we can also use the rankings, the standing rankings of the different federation we work with. So here the idea, well, the athletes may not wait to reach the top level to use performance enhancing drugs, but the duty of our clients are most of the time, so the international federation and the major events, is to focus on the top level athletes. So this is why we are using also this this indicator, the performance. We did recently also another thing related to the performance. It was to identify the peak performance age bracket in each sport. So this is also an interesting information, I think, to consider in the risk assessment, to identify when is the beginning and the retirement stages for the athletes engaged in a particular sport. We also systematically evaluate the testing history of the athletes, and we do that in order to sustain equity between athletes in terms of testing. So we integrate also this variable into our risk assessment. So we are extracting this information, we combine this information, we match all the names, we developed the individual risk assessment, and on the top of that, we will have additional information that will be considered on a case-by-case basis, and it will be the additional inputs coming from the testing, from the ABP, and from the INI.
And Rona, I will jump in and mention the acronyms ABP and INI may not be familiar to
Sorry.
everyone.
Ouais.
So ABP,
Alors, ABP,
athlete biological
athlete
passport.
biological passport, and INI, intelligence and investigation. Sorry for that.
All good, especially with different languages and simultaneous translation. We want to make sure for such a technical webinar that we explain everything. Should we go on to our poll, or is there anything else that you want to say in this slide, Rona?
That's fine for me.
Okay, excellent. So let's go back to our audience now. Thank you very much for this explanation and this introduction to the risk assessment. We will now ask the audience another question, and this one is a yes or a no question to get your feedback, and it's quite an easy one from my perspective. So the question is the risk assessment the only tool used in the planning of a testing program? And again, a yes or no option. And while we wait for the responses to come in, a reminder that you can use the Q&A function to send your questions to us. If you have any questions about what you just heard from Rona, feel free to send them to us and we'll answer them at the end. And in the meantime, a few more hellos to the different regions and countries joining us. So hello to Puerto Rico, Brazil, Serbia, Kenya, Angola, Turkey, South Korea, USA, and the Philippines. I'm sorry if I missed somebody. I tried to go through the chat and see everybody writing in, but I may have missed a few more. Okay, great. So let's close down the poll and see the results. And most of you have answered no. So no, the risk assessment is not the only tool used in the planning of a testing program. And perhaps, Rona, you can speak to that on our next slide for a few minutes, which will be a really good transition then to invite Richard back. So we'll close this down and stop sharing the results with you and go to our next page. Rona, I give the floor back to you for these next few minutes.
Thank you, Olia. And yes, so let's talk a little bit more now about the relationship between the risk assessment and the test distribution plan. So the risk assessment is updated once a year. So the idea is really to have a systematic analysis of the parameters included in the risk assessment in order to establish the TDP baseline. But once we define this baseline, the TDP will remain dynamic. So the testing department will run the TDP, and during the season, throughout the season, the TDP will be refined based on other type of information, grounded information collected by the testing team, adjustments also linked to the ABP findings during the season, or the intelligence investigations teams. So this is really something dynamic, but we have to start from somewhere, and we do it with the risk assessment, and after the TDP remains a dynamic process.
Excellent, thank you. So we have the conclusion from your end before we hand it over to Richard. So I'll let you speak to this last slide.
So in summary, yes, the risk assessment is a comprehensive analysis that provides reliable and reproducible results. So from global to local levels, from the country, the sport, but also from some individual parameters, as we discussed, performance, testing history. We have to keep in mind also that the rationalization of the test distribution plan can also increase its predictability. So we have to be more accurate, but also less predictable. So this is also another side of the work, is also to have a retrospective analysis of what has been done in the past, and try to add more variations also in the anti-doping system. And finally, the risk assessment, so it's an well-informed assessment to optimize deterrence, detection, and also prevention of doping in sport. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Rona.
Let you continue the presentation.
Thank you very much, Rona, and we'll see you back for the question and answer. But we really hope that this was a useful introduction for you to the risk assessment. We know that there are some athletes and coaches who are joining, but also many members of national anti-doping agencies. So we're really happy to have you here with us to cover this topic. And again, don't hesitate to send us your questions. But in the meantime, we are going to transition to this practical application that Rona already briefly mentioned. And for this, I'm welcoming back Richard, who we already see with us on the screen. And let's talk here now about how an effective testing strategy is developed. So Richard, I'll let you tell us how a risk assessment is applied to a testing strategy.
Perfect. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Olia, for the question. So in order to develop an effective testing strategy for an anti-doping organization, I think the crucial factors that Ronan has highlighted as part of the development of a risk assessment need to be taken into consideration in order to prioritize the resources that a anti-doping organization has and focus them based upon the risks identified throughout the risk assessment process. So as much as we may wish that anti-doping organizations had unlimited amounts of resources at our disposal, this often isn't the case, and therefore not all athletes can be tested. So therefore it's really important that we focus our resources based upon those risks that have been identified in the risk assessment, prioritizing the highest risk athletes, the highest risk sport disciplines, nations that have been identified throughout the risk assessment process. So when developing a risk-based testing distribution plan, an anti-doping organization should determine which sports, disciplines, and countries are considered higher risk, which athletes should be targeted, and then the distribution of out of competition versus in competition testing, as well as also the types of samples and analysis that would be conducted based upon the outcomes of the risk assessment. So following the establishing the athletes your anti-doping organization has jurisdiction over, the anti-doping organization should prioritize different sports, disciplines, and identify high-risk countries in which testing should be prioritized on. When assessing, so first of all, taking a look at the sport disciplines and as well as also nations that we would want to prioritize, is important to take into consideration the physiological demands of the sport, history of doping for that particular sport or country, as well as also the popularity of that sport and the financial incentives that could determine whether or not either a sport discipline or a particular country is of a higher risk. The international federations and major events organizers is of a particular importance to identify high priority countries based upon perceived corruption, corruption within that country, as well as also previous doping within that sport for that nation. And therefore, anti-doping organizations can dedicate greater levels of resources to athletes in these higher risk disciplines from these higher risk nations. So once we've determined which sports, disciplines, and countries we are assigning higher priorities to, the focus should be on prioritizing which athletes also have the highest risk of doping. So there's several factors that we can analyze in terms of, I guess, on an individual athlete basis, such as performance, previous anti-doping rule violation information, which I'll go into a little bit greater detail when we come on to the implementation of effective testing program. Next, taking a look at our distribution of in-competition and out-of-competition testing. During the risk assessment process, we will identify the most likely substances to be used and the associated risk periods for the administration of these substances based upon the physiological demands of the sport. As an example, if the risk assessment process identifies the physiological demands of a particular sport discipline, of say cardiovascular endurance or power development, and then and substances which will enhance these characteristics, a greater focus in terms of our testing resources should be focused on out of competition testing, whereas if substances such as stimulants or narcotics are identified as part of the risk assessment process, then a higher proportion of resources should be focused on in-competition testing. Finally, I think one of the other really important aspects of prioritization for an anti-doping organization is the different sample types and analysis types that should be considered when implementing your testing program, including the incorporation of WADA's technical document, sport-specific analysis. Not all of the tests have the same objectives, so therefore, based upon the physiological risks of a sport, you need to ensure that we're collecting the right samples at the right time and ensuring that we're analysing those for the correct substances based upon the risks identified in the risk assessment.
Thank you very much, Richard. A very complex process indeed. I don't know if we made it easier or more complicated for our listeners when they learn about all the factors that are included in a risk assessment. But this is what you work on a daily basis, is planning your testing strategy based on this information. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how you do this, Richard.
Sure thing. So once I guess we've determined and developed our testing distribution plan and the overarching strategy for based upon our analysis via the risk assessment, it's crucial for anti-doping organizations and the ITA to gather as much information as possible to implement an effective testing program and targeting athletes at the right place, right time, and for the right substances. For the implementation of an effective testing program, testing should be targeted at athletes which have been identified as high risk through this risk assessment process. So there's several factors which are highlighted on the screen now, which we should always consider when focusing our resources on particular athletes. First of all, looking at athlete performance, athletes should focus resources on those athletes who are performing at the highest level, as well as also competing internationally and also at national competitions. However, we can also use performance monitoring to identify any suspicious performance patterns, trends associated with, I guess, our testing strategy to then inform when and who we decide to test moving forward with our testing, the implementation of an effective testing program. Whilst performance is a really key element to I guess implementing our targeted approach to testing here at the ITA, there are several other factors that we would consider analysing as part of the risk assessment process and the implementation of our TDP, such as the analysis of athletes' testing histories to determine if athletes have previously had anti-doping rule violations or adverse analytical findings, which would ultimately mean that these athletes are deemed a higher risk, as well as also athletes who, based upon previous testing histories, haven't been tested sufficiently and may warrant further investigation and further resources dedicated to them. There are also other factors that we need to consider, such as monitoring of athlete whereabouts information to identify athletes who are potentially traveling to remote locations where testing is logistically challenging, which again, maybe potentially they could be using those training camps and going to those remote locations to avoid testing. And one of the other areas that we need to monitor as part of an implementation of an effective testing program is also how an athlete is potentially manipulating whereabouts information to avoid testing. Any athletes that we observe who are potentially manipulating or have suspicious whereabouts information may be deemed to be higher priority as part of this process. Intelligence and the interpretation of athlete biological passport information can also be used to identify athletes which are more suspicious than others, therefore resulting in more resources being dedicated to these athletes. As well as also these sort of factors as part of our testing program, we'll also take a look at, I guess, the stage in which of an athlete's career. So as Ronan mentioned as part of his discussion, analysing the peak performance brackets, as well as also the testing team will look at when, I guess, athletes' contracts are potentially running out, and does this make an athlete potentially at higher risk than athletes who have a long contract available. So therefore, this sort of information is also very useful for us, as well as additional information such as the analysis of associated third parties with history of doping, as well as also injury status of the athlete, additional information like this. The more information we can gather will really inform our targeted approach and which athletes we decide to target. As mentioned previously, one of the most important elements of developing an effective testing program is ensuring that we test athletes at the right place for the right substances at the right time. So therefore, in order to ensure that the periodization of our testing strategy is effective, we will identify several factors which we will analyze and review as part of this implementation. So firstly, an athlete's competition schedule should be analyzed as part of implementing this effective testing program, as this will provide an anti-doping organization with an insight into which athletes or which events athletes are targeting throughout the season. When this information is combined with potential performance enhancing substances which have been identified through the risk assessment process, anti-doping organizations such as the ITA can determine and develop a testing strategy and testing plans to test athletes during these high risk windows to detect and deter athletes from using these prohibited substances. Also, anti-doping organizations have several tools at their disposal to be able to influence, I guess, our testing strategy. So again, one of those tools is the athlete biological passport, which will, again, we can interpret to further guide our testing and identify suspicious periods of the year and sanction follow-up testing. Furthermore, laboratories can also provide anti-doping organizations with useful feedback for further analysis of samples, as well as also identify any unusual trends, which then can further guide testing on specific athletes. One of the vital elements which will also influence the testing, timing of testing, is obtaining and assessing anti-doping intelligence information from all available sources at the ITA and at other anti-doping organizations. Intelligence can be received through anonymous whistleblowing, as well as also informants providing information relating to the doping strategies of athletes. And when we've analyzed this information and determined if it's credible or not, then we can also initiate further targeted testing of these athletes. Finally, anti-doping, I guess, always needs to remain unpredictable to avoid athletes identifying any strategies that we are employing. So international federations, major events organizers should consider several factors when planning and implementing their testing program to ensure that their testing program doesn't become predictable, because when a testing program becomes predictable, it also becomes ineffective, as athletes can sort of predict potentially when they would, again, when testers will come, which is one of the very fundamentals of the doping control process. So as part of, I guess, developing and implementing an effective testing program, one of the really key elements now of developing this strategy is, and one of the very effective tools that anti-doping organizations have at their disposal, is the storage of samples and also potential further analysis of said samples once they've been, I guess, stored, and then there's a development of future techniques, as well as, I guess, additional information being received by anti-doping organizations to guide our testing strategy. Furthermore, as part of implementing an effective testing program, anti-doping organizations should coordinate their testing programs. So international federations, national anti-doping organizations, and major events organizers need to ensure that we are communicating to collaborate on various aspects of our programs, including the sharing of test plans, whereabouts information between the organizations, establishing collaborative targeted testing strategies of athletes deemed of high risk, as well as also sharing intelligence information. And finally, as Ronan's mentioned, as part of the development of the risk assessment, is it vital that this remains a dynamic and adaptable process where the testing department is feeding back information into the risk assessment. So anti-doping organizations should regularly monitor the implementation of their testing strategy by reviewing the outcomes of testing, the analysis of data to evaluate whether or not the testing strategy implemented is effective. And then this should be fed back into the risk assessment and reviewed by continually reviewed and updating the risk assessment for the anti-doping organization.
Thank you very much, Richard, for the presentation and for taking the time to explain how you implement the risk assessment in your programs and in our ITA programs. We hope that this was helpful to our listeners. From the athlete perspective, one of the questions that we get all the time is, am I tested based on my results? Am I tested based on other information? Is it random? And the answer is always, it's a combination of factors. And now we can certainly see how many factors are taken into consideration when planning this process. Before we move on, I'm going to launch another question for the audience. And we are moving into education and prevention now. So the question that you see on the screen is, do you think that the risk assessment is useful when planning anti-doping education programs? And the answer is, the options are yes and no. In the meantime, I'm going to give my last shout outs. I went through the chat and saw some familiar names and people coming back for the webinars. Again, thank you for being here. And apologies for those that I missed, but hello to Côte d'Ivoire, Lebanon, Colombia, Bahrain, Morocco, Italy, Barbados, and Switzerland. So we have a very high response rate once again. We will close now the poll and see the responses. Of course, 97%. We were at 100% for a little while, but 97% of you said that yes, risk assessment is useful when planning anti-doping education programs. And indeed, that is the case. So I will spend the next few minutes on education and prevention. So this is our final section of the webinar. Again, you would have seen many of the factors if you do work in education that Richard explained that can apply to both testing and education. And the risk assessment is indeed a very useful tool for us. So firstly, we will take a look at the physiopharmacological risk assessment and how it gives us some good insight about the different sports that we work with. So it allows us to understand which substances provide most benefits to athletes competing in a particular sport. So let's look at this example on the screen. It may be very similar to what Ronan showed you earlier today. And here, strength and power are the characteristic that has the highest physiological score. You can see that it's a score of 8 compared to much lower scores for the other characteristics 1 through 5. This is a specific set, or there is a specific set of prohibited substances that are known to help increase strength and power, build muscle mass, elevate testosterone levels, and so on. But so far, again, this is a repetition of what my colleagues have said, but how does it help the education efforts? Well, first and foremost, if we look at the types of substances found in positive tests associated with anti-doping rule violations, we can easily tell whether the cases are inadvertent or if they are intentional doping, at least most of the time. In this particular example, if none or very few of the substances actually show up in positive tests, it is very likely that most cases are inadvertent. That means that athletes have no intention to dope and lack basic information needed to allow them to compete clean. On the other hand, if there's a strong correlation between the substances identified in the risk assessment and those that show up in positive tests, that is, of course, a strong indicator of intentional doping. So already that gives you a very good idea of the behaviors in a sport. And this is important to understand because it guides the content of the education program for a particular sport. For example, the program can focus on a set of specific substance classes and their negative effects. And for sports with a lot of intentional doping cases, we come back to values-based education because it becomes even more important. And for sports with a lot of unintentional doping cases, providing access to basic information and basic anti-doping education becomes a priority. So of course, we need to protect those clean athletes and athlete support personnel who have no intention to cheat, but may simply not have the right tools or resources to educate themselves. So this is an important consideration, an important observation to make based on the risk assessment, as it is quite objective. So again, this information here is especially useful for national and international federations because it helps us as administrators and as educators better understand the sport. But of course, this is useful for any organization working with athletes and their support personnel, whether it's a national anti-doping organization or even a major event organizer. So let's now look at the country risk assessment. And here, of course, we can also see how this information can inform an education program. What we often see is that the quality of national level education programs correlates with the risk of doping. The lower the level of education activity, the higher the risk of doping of a country is. This information is useful for international federations and major event organizations because it allows these organizations to make better use of limited resources. And as we know, that's a very frequent conversation about the limited resources. So this helps by developing educational materials, in specific languages based on the country risk analysis, and targeting specific countries during education activities, or making education mandatory for highest risk regions. So again, these were just a few very high-level examples of how a risk assessment can be incorporated in an education strategy. There's many other things that a national anti-doping organization can do, an international federation, or even a national federation with the information available in the risk assessment. For example, national anti-doping organizations can also review individual athlete risk and the athlete's testing history in order to create an efficient program that prioritizes prevention over testing. And of course, as we know, that's the key message of the international standard for education. So again, a very quick and a high-level overview for the purpose of time. And we will now move on to the resources to wrap up the webinar before we go to questions and answers. A reminder that you will receive these slides after the session ends, and these resources are all going to be clickable links. Now you can see a few references on your screen, and if you want to do any further reading, please by all means feel free to explore these articles and standards and guidelines. Great, so with a few minutes to go, let's move on to the audience questions, and I will welcome back Rona and Richard for this section right here. And I will pull up the Q&A, and I can see there's some questions coming in. We will go top to bottom, even if we can't address them all with a full answer, we will do our best. So Mauricio is asking if it's possible to become a chaperone for the ITA. Please do email us. We will put our contact information on the screen. There are programs that we have, training programs. So Mauricio, we will put you in touch with the right person. But you can email us at education@ita.sport. So that was our first question, and we can move on to a question from France about artificial intelligence, whether it's used by the ITA and where. And I wish this question was asked during the Intelligence and Investigations webinar just a few months back, as it is, I think, more or better suited for our colleagues in I&I. So I personally don't have an exact answer for you, France, but it's something I'm happy to look into with my I&I colleagues and then get back to you with an answer. So please do email us. We check all of our emails that we receive. And again, I'm sorry, I can't give a more precise answer, but I don't know if Rona or Richard, you have any thoughts on artificial intelligence for this question?
But it's not implemented at the moment, but yes, feel free to reach out to us and to the I&I department. Regarding that also, well, it's always, I think there is no, why we always need to have some, it's quite difficult to put in place, looking at knowing all the parameters that we have to consider. But I think it's more but
it's a hard question.
Yeah, it's a hard one.
This is, as we always say, we keep the platform completely open to be able for everyone to ask any questions, easy or hard questions. So France, please do get in touch with us at education@ita.sport, and we will be in touch with our colleagues to give you a more accurate response for your question. Just a bit more of a housekeeping question from Atouman. S'il est possible de trouver le document en français. Our decks are always in English, but we welcome our colleagues from any French-speaking NATOs. If you're interested, we're always happy to share the materials so you can translate them. So all of our materials, including this presentation, are open to our colleagues to use if you wish to. So our apologies for not being able to offer the text in multiple languages, but we hope that the simultaneous translation is helpful. All right, I will move on to Franz again. You keep us on our toes with the difficult questions, so I will read out the next one. So we increase the budget, the footprint every year, but the detection rate goes down. Is this a success of the program? If yes, what is the best balance between budget and detection rate? So I don't know, Richard or Ronan, if you have any thoughts on this question.
I can go first. So I think it's a really interesting question to, I guess, one that we actually debate in the office quite regularly in terms of how do we define what is an effective testing program, as again, detection rates around the world average in between 1% and 2% of samples returning an adverse analytical finding. So I think it's a really good question in terms of, again, understanding what is the true prevalence of doping within the athlete population, and then being able to determine whether or not, I guess the program that we're putting in place is sufficient to be able to actually catch those athletes who are cheating. And I think this is why having samples stored for long-term storage is a really effective part of implementing a risk-based testing program to ensure that we maximize the window of detection for athletes based upon the development of new techniques during the course of that 10-year jurisdiction period. Based upon, I guess, and I think that's one of the areas that we need to also assess is, I guess, what is the criteria for a successful program? Because whilst you may be increasing the resources and the amount of tests that you're doing, this may be also having the add-on effect of adding to the deterrence effect of your program. So it's a really difficult one to be able to actually answer. Of how can you really define what is an effective program, and then based upon what is the best balance between the budget and the detection rate, I think this has to be based purely on the risk assessment. So you should focus your budget based upon the outcomes of the risk assessment and making sure that that is proportionate to the risks within your sport.
Thank you, Richard. And we have 1 minute to go, and I can see here that we didn't get to Shivani, Bridget, Stefan, Gabrielle. So we apologize for not being able to take your questions. But again, we will put our contact information up on the screen so you can reach us after this webinar, and we'll be happy to take any of these questions. Again, it's education@ita.sport. So I will wrap up the webinar now and thank our presenters and our panelists, Richard and Ronan. Thank you very much. And of course, a big thank you to everyone who has joined us on the session today. We hope that you found it valuable, even though we always do run out of time for those questions. After the webinar ends, you will receive a link to the survey along with the presentation slides. And we ask you to please take a few minutes to fill out the survey, as your feedback is extremely helpful for our education programs. And finally, if you would like to receive updates from the ITA, including information about upcoming webinar sessions, you can sign up using the QR code or the link in the slides. So once again, thank you, Ronan, thank you, Richard, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. I wish you a good evening, good afternoon, or good morning from Lausanne, and we'll see you online again next month. Thank you very much.